January 17th, 1944. Somewhere over the English Channel. The sky is cold. Gray clouds hang low over the water, and the wind carries the smell of salt and engine oil. Inside the cockpit of a B-17 Flying Fortress, two American pilots sit strapped into their seats, their hands steady on the controls. The bomber is fully loaded not with bombs, but with 20,000 pounds of high explosives packed into every available space. The aircraft groans under the weight. Behind them, the fuselage is empty. No gunners, no bombardier, no navigator. Just steel and TNT in silence at 10,000 feet. The pilots check their instruments one last time. The target is a German V-weapon. Sight in Pas-de-Calais, across the Channel. The kind of target that has resisted conventional bombing for months. The kind of target that demands something new, something desperate. The pilots exchange a glance. Then, without ceremony, they flip the arming switches, rise from their seats, and move toward the rear of the aircraft. They strap on their parachutes. They open the hatch. And they jump. The B-17 continues flying, alone. Behind it, in a trailing aircraft, another pilot takes control, not with his hands, but with a radio and a set of crude electronic commands. The bomber, now pilotless, now a guided missile weighing 30 tons, turns toward the French coast. The engines roar. The explosive payload hums with potential energy. And the German crews on the ground, watching this metal ghost descend toward them, realize too late what they are witnessing. This is Operation Anvil. This is the moment. American engineers turned obsolete bombers into the world's first remote-controlled cruise missiles. And this is the moment the war changed, not with strategy or doctrine, but with desperation, ingenuity, and the willingness to make machines do what men could not. The story of Operation Anvil does not begin in the skies over France. It begins in the summer of 1943, in the aftermath of the Allied bombing campaigns over Germany. By then, the United States Army Air Forces had committed thousands of heavy bombers to the strategic bombing offensive, an effort to cripple Nazi war production and break the morale of the German people. The B-17 and B-24 bombers flew in massive formations, dropping tons of ordnance on factories, rail yards, and oil refineries. But the campaign was costly. German flak batteries and fighter squadrons exacted a brutal toll. Entire bomber groups were decimated. Crews who survived one mission faced the statistical certainty that they would not survive 25. And yet, the most dangerous targets remained untouched. Along the French and Belgian coasts, the Germans had constructed fortified launch sites for their new V-weapons, the V-1 flying bomb and the V-2 rocket. These sites were small, hardened, and difficult to hit with conventional bombing. The V-1, a pilotless jet-powered bomb, could strike London with terrifying regularity. The V-2, a ballistic missile, could not be intercepted at all. The threat they posed was not just military but psychological. The British government was desperate. Churchill himself demanded action. The American answer was not more bombs. It was fewer men. By early 1944, the U.S. military had accumulated hundreds of B-17 and B-24 bombers too damaged or worn out for regular combat missions. These aircraft, known as war-weary, were destined for scrap or spare parts. But a small group of engineers and officers saw another possibility. If the bombers could not carry crews safely to their targets, why carry crews at all? Why not strip the aircraft down, fill them with explosives, and fly them into the target by remote control? The technology already existed, crude, experimental, but functional. Radio control systems had been tested on drones. The concept of guided munitions was not new. What was new was the scale. What was new was the willingness to turn a flying fortress into a flying bomb. Operation Aphrodite, later renamed Operation Anvil when applied to B-24 Liberators, was born from this logic. The plan was simple in theory. A pilot and co-pilot would take off in the explosive-laden bomber, climb to altitude, arm the payload, and then bail out over friendly territory. A mothership, flying behind and equipped with radio control equipment, would then guide the drone bomber to its target using a primitive television camera mounted in the nose of the aircraft. The bomber would crash into the target, detonating its payload with the force of a small earthquake. The engineers knew it was dangerous. They knew it was experimental. But they also knew that the V-weapon sites had to be destroyed. And so, in the summer of 1944, Operation Anvil began. The men who volunteered for Anvil were not told everything. They were told the missions were high risk. They were told the bombers were expendable. They were told they were told they would be jumping out of an aircraft loaded with enough explosives to vaporize a city block. What they were not told, what no one could have told them, was how fragile the technology truly was. The radio control systems were unreliable. The television cameras often failed. The bombers, already worn from months of combat, were prone to mechanical failure. And the process of arming the payload flipping switches that turned the aircraft into a live bomb was something no pilot had been trained for. There was no manual, no protocol, just improvisation and courage. The first missions were disasters. On August 4th, 1944, Lieutenant Joseph P. Kennedy, Jr., older brother of the future president, took off from R.F. Thursfield in a B-24 Liberator loaded with 21,000 pounds of Torpedoes explosive. His mission was to destroy a V-weapon bunker in northern France. Kennedy and his co-pilot, Lieutenant Wilford J. Willey, climbed to 2,000 feet, armed the payload, and prepared to bail out. They never got the chance. At 6:20 p.m., the aircraft exploded in midair over the English countryside. The blast was so powerful it was felt 12 miles away. Kennedy and Willey were killed instantly. No trace of their bodies was ever found. The investigation revealed nothing conclusive. A faulty arming circuit, a stray electrical signal, a moment of mechanical failure. The truth was lost in the fireball, but the program continued. The need was too great, the targets too critical, and the men kept volunteering. For the German defenders, the sight of these ghost bombers was unlike anything they had encountered. Luftwaffe pilots reported American bombers flying without escorts, without evasive maneuvers, without any sign of human control. Flat gunners watched as B-17s and B-24s approached their positions in straight, unbroken flight paths, ignoring the bursts of anti-aircraft fire, ignoring the laws of self-preservation. Some of the German crews believed the Americans had gone mad. Others suspected a new kind of terror weapon. A few understood the truth, that the bombers were already dead, piloted by radio and filled with enough explosives to erase everything within 100 yards. One German flak officer, stationed near Calais, later wrote in his diary, "We shot at it until it came apart in the air, but it did not turn. It did not climb or dive. It flew like a coffin with wings. When it exploded, the sound was not of bombs. It was of the earth splitting open. The psychological effect was immediate. The German crews knew they could shoot down fighters. They knew they could survive bombing raids. But this was something different. This was machinery without fear, without hesitation, without the human instinct for survival. This was the future of war, and it terrified them. But Operation Anvil was never fully successful. Of the dozen missions flown between August and October 1944, only a handful struck their targets. Most crashed short, some were shot down. Others simply failed, lost control, veered off course, or fell into the sea. The radio systems were too primitive. The television guidance too unreliable. The weather over the channel too unpredictable. And the targets reinforced concrete bunkers, built to withstand anything short of a direct hit by a battleship shell proved nearly indestructible. By October, the program was quietly shelved. The V-weapon sites were eventually overrun by advancing Allied ground forces. The threat diminished. The need for suicide drones evaporated. And the men who had flown those missions, those who survived, were reassigned to conventional units, their service classified, their sacrifice unrecorded in the official histories. But the technology did not disappear. The lessons learned from Anvil laid the groundwork for everything that followed. The concept of the drone, the guided missile, the unmanned strike platform, all of it traces back to those war-weary bombers and the engineers who dared to imagine a weapon that required no pilot, no crew, no human sacrifice beyond the moment of arming and departure. There is a photograph taken in August 1944, just days before Kennedy's fatal mission. It shows a group of Anvil pilots standing in front of a B-24 Liberator. They are young. They are smiling. They wear their flight jackets and leather helmets, with the casual confidence of men who believe they will survive. Behind them, the bomber looms large, its nose painted with a cartoon of a grinning bomb, its fuselage scarred with patches and rivets. The photograph is grainy, black and white, the kind of image that looks like a memory even when it is new. What the photograph does not show is what happened next. What it does not show is the moment those men climbed into that aircraft armed. 20,000 pounds of explosives and prepared to jump into the sky over England. What it does not show is the sound of the engines after the pilots bailed out, a sound that continued, alone, until it was swallowed by the explosion or the sea or the earth. What the photograph does not show is the future. A future where bombers would fly without pilots, where missiles would strike without warning, where the machinery of war would grow so complex and so distant that the men who operated it would no longer need to be present when the weapon struck. Operation Anvil was a failure by the standards of 1944, but by the standards of history, it was a prophecy. The German soldiers who survived the war carried many memories. They remembered the cold of the Eastern Front, the chaos of Normandy, the bombing raids over Hamburg and Dresden. But some of them, those who served in the coastal flak batteries, those who watched the drone bombers come, remembered something else. They remembered the silence, the way those aircraft flew without radio chatter, without the roar of human voices over the intercom. They remembered the straightness of the flight path, the mechanical certainty of it. And they remembered the explosions, not the sound, but the feeling, the way the ground shook, the way the air seemed to compress and then release, as if the world itself had taken a breath. One former Luftwaffe pilot, interviewed decades later, described it this way: "We knew how to fight men. We knew how to fight aircraft. But this was not fighting. This was waiting. Waiting for the machine to decide when you would die." In the end, Operation Anvil killed more Americans than Germans. Kennedy and Willie, others whose names were lost or classified. Men who volunteered for a mission that offered no glory, no medals, no recognition beyond the knowledge that they had tried something no one else had dared. They climbed into bombers that had already been condemned. They armed explosives that could detonate at any moment. And they jumped into the sky, trusting that the technology, crude, experimental, unproven, would do what human hands could not. They were wrong. The technology failed. The missions failed. But the idea survived. Today, we call them drones, predators, reapers, unmanned aerial vehicles. We watch them on screens, control them from thousands of miles away, and speak of precision and efficiency, and minimizing risk. We have forgotten that the first drone pilots were not operators in trailers. They were men in cockpits, arming bombs with their own hands, jumping into the void, and hoping the machine would do what they could not. We have forgotten Operation Anvil, but the Germans did not. They saw it, they felt it, and they understood, perhaps earlier than anyone else, that the future of war would not be won by the bravest soldiers or the strongest nations. It would be won by those who could turn machines into weapons and weapons into ghosts. There is a quiet irony in the fact that the most terrifying weapon of Operation Anvil was not the explosive payload. It was the absence. The absence of pilots. The absence of fear. The absence of anything human inside those bombers as they flew their final missions. The Germans had built bunkers to withstand bombs. They had trained gunners to shoot down fighters. They had prepared for every kind of attack they could imagine, but they had not prepared for the ghost, and neither, in the end, had the Americans. The men who flew those missions expected to bail out, to parachute to safety, to survive. Most did, but some did not. And the ones who did not, who vanished in fireballs or crashed into the sea or simply disappeared, became ghosts themselves. Ghosts in the machine, ghosts in the history books, ghosts in the memory of a war that tried to imagine a future where courage was no longer necessary, where sacrifice could be automated, where victory could be achieved without the presence of men. Operation Anvil failed, but its ghost flies on in every drone strike, in every guided missile, in every unmanned weapon that crosses a border, strikes a target, and returns to silence. We have built the future that Anvil imagined. We have perfected the machine. We have removed the men, but we have not removed the cost. We have only hidden it behind screens, behind distance, behind the illusion that war can be fought without presence, without risk, without the weight of human hands arming the bomb and human voices saying goodbye. The men who flew Operation Anvil knew better. They climbed into the cockpit. They flipped the switches. They felt the weight, and then they jumped, and the bomber flew on, alone, into history, into the target, into the silence that follows every great invention, the silence that asks not whether we can build such a thing, but whether we should. The answer, in 1944, was yes. The need was too great, the enemy too dangerous, the stakes too high. But the answer today, in a world where drones circle endlessly, where missiles strike without warning, where the machinery of war has become so distant that we forget, there are still hands somewhere, still voices, still men and women making the choice to arm the weapon and send it. Flying the answer today is not so clear. Operation Anvil was a failure, but it was also a warning that the most dangerous weapon is not the bomb. It is the distance between the hand that arms the weapon and the moment of impact, the distance between the decision to strike and the sight of the explosion, the distance that allows us to forget that every weapon, no matter how advanced, no matter how precise, no matter how unmanned, every weapon begins with a human choice. And every choice carries a cost. The men who flew Operation Anvil paid that cost with their lives, with their fear, with the courage to climb into a bomber filled with explosives and trust that the machine would do what they could not. They were the first drone pilots, the first to see the future of war, the first to understand that the most terrifying weapon is not the one that kills the most, but the one that kills without presence, without witness, without the weight of looking into the eyes of the enemy and seeing yourself reflected back. They saw it, they flew it, and they jumped, and the bomber flew on, into history, into silence, into the question that still haunts us. What does it mean to fight a war when the warriors are no longer there?